Now, yesterday was the day that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party finally began running scared from reform. We saw a lightly planted question in the House of Commons set up to try and stifle reform's momentum. We also discussed on yesterday's show how Number 10 Downing Street has dispatched strategy experts and advisors to try and support Labour MPs on issues that clearly matter to reform voters. And it's no doubt that this all stems from reform's surge in the polls, including today's poll from Find Out Now, which has reform leading by 4 percentage points. But now it seems the Conservative Party is following Labour's lead. Ever since Kemi Badenoch became leader, she has insisted the party was not ready to issue policies. But finally, we now have a policy from the new Tory leader. Check this out.
We need to make sure that all of the people who are here have to have a meaningful contribution to the UK. So one of the things that we would be changing is making sure that people are net contributors to the UK. British citizenship is not an entitlement, it is not a right, it is a privilege. And we have one of the easiest routes to citizenship.
So the Tories are now proposing that jobless and low-paid legal migrants will be banned from settling indefinitely in the UK. Up until now, they could apply after having lived in the UK for just 5 years, but under this new policy, the requirements would be stricter. Migrants would need to have lived in the UK for 10 years, having been working in that time, not claiming benefits and not living in social housing. They also will have had to have been net contributors to our economy, our society, in order to stay as well. But many will be left thinking this is too little, too late, reminded of what 14 years of Tory immigration policy left Britain with. Brexit, remember, was meant to be a promise to end the era of mass uncontrolled immigration, to lower the overall numbers, as the Conservatives told us in their 2019 manifesto. But of course, the Conservative Party betrayed the country on that issue. If we look at the 3 years that followed the COVID pandemic, we saw numbers that were simply mind-boggling. In the year to December 2021, net migration reached nearly 500,000. In 2022, it was nearly 900,000. In 2023, it was about the same figure. That's a net 2 million people in just 3 years. Only about 22% of those people, by the way, happen to come in on worker visas. And when you look at the fine print, it becomes even more remarkable, shocking even. In the first half of 2024, get this, Britain issued 15,000 health and social care visas to people coming to work in health and social care, but issued 60,000 visas to their relatives. In the first half of 2024, we gave 1,000 health visas to people from Zimbabwe, and they brought 10,000 relatives, 10 dependents for every worker. Our immigration system is simply the laughing stock of the world. For too long, the economic consensus has opted for mass migration as an artificial means of growing the economy. It's good for big business. It gives them cheap migrant workers. But in reality, it's making us poorer, as even the Office for Budget Responsibility now accepts. In fact, all of the academic research, I would argue, shows that the kind of migration that is now coming into Western economies is making us poorer, not richer. And while this new policy proposal from the Tories is a move in the right direction, it barely scratches the surface. As ever, let me know your views at gbnews.com/yoursay, or meet me on X at GoodwinMJ. But I'm joined now in the studio by leader writer at The Telegraph, Sam Ashworth-Hayes, as well as my panel, founder of Novara Media, Aaron Bastani, and political commentator Charlie Dowes. Sam, Kemi Badenoch is going to be hoping that this new policy proposal will be enough to win back the one in four Conservative Party voters who say they're going to Nigel Farage and reform. Will it be enough?
I don't think so on its own. It's a good starting point. It had to be done. But the Conservative Party has so much ground and credibility to win back on the issue of migration. As you've gone through those figures, people saw the last 14 years of Conservative government, and they need to send a really costly signal about this. And from my point of view, personally speaking, I think the way they're going to have to do this is by going further on this, by laying out further policies for migration once they're in power, and possibly by looking at how you deal with the previous wave that arrived, because many of these people will be offered ILR in the next few years, and that will lock in tens of billions of pounds worth of fiscal costs for the taxpayer unless you have a plan.
So just forgive me for my confusion. So is Kemi Badenoch saying that the people who have arrived in recent years are going to be denied indefinite leave to remain, so they can stay here forever, basically? Or is she saying it's only people going forward who will be denied indefinite leave to remain unless they've contributed to the national economy?
My understanding was that it's going to be a policy going forward.
Going forward, in which case the millions of people who came in under the Tories, now under the Labour government, will be eligible to stay in the country forever, including relatives, racking up these big net fiscal costs. Aaron, the era of low-skill, low-wage, uncontrolled immigration has got to come to an end, right? Even Labour MPs this week have said to Keir Starmer, a handful of them at least, we need to get tougher on immigration.
There's two things going on here. There's the question you asked me there about immigration, its role for the UK economy, who's it working for, who's it not working for. I'll come back to that in a moment. I don't want to look evasive to you, Matt.
Sure.
First point, though, of course, because it's a proposal coming from Kemi Badenoch, I suppose I'd open up to everybody here. If you care about immigration in this country, if you think it's too high, if you think it's been too high for too long and it's not working for the country, some people will agree with that, some will disagree. But if you think that, why on earth would you vote for the Conservative Party? What's their USP? If I really think that, I'll vote for reform. If it's of third, fourth, fifth importance, but I care about things like the NHS, I'll vote maybe Labour. If I want proportional representation, I'll go Lib Dem. Climate, Greens, you get the picture. I don't know what the unique selling point of the Conservative Party is. And that poll you started this show on with Find Out Now, putting them on 18%, I find that quite plausible. There are some polls putting them above 20%, and I'm thinking, well, they got 24 in July 2024. It seems strange to me they've only just edged down a little bit further since then, given the polling rise of reform. I think we shouldn't write out the possibility of them getting below 20% in the next general election.
I mean, Charlie Downs, do you think there is any way the Conservative Party can out-reform reform on immigration? Do you think there's a way that Kemi Badenoch can actually get ahead of Farage on that issue? Or as Aaron is saying, basically it's too late?
Well, it is refreshing to have some actual tangible policy being put forward by the right in Britain. But just in answer to your question, Aaron, I actually think that with, the polls being what they are now, we might start to see people saying, don't vote Conservatives because you'll be splitting the Reform vote. So perhaps actually the role of these two parties has reversed. Perhaps now the role of the Conservative Party is to be a pressure group from the right against Reform, which is very interesting because if you listen to figures like, for instance, Robert Jenrick, Nick Timothy, Neil O'Brien, and so forth, they are using, I think, much stronger rhetoric than Reform are when it comes to immigration. Like Robert Jenrick, during his leadership campaign, for instance, was able to campaign to the right of Reform on these issues. And I think that might actually be the utility of the Conservative Party now.
Albeit within the context of a liberal Conservative parliamentary party. I mean, Sam, just to perhaps put ourselves in a position of maybe sort of the Conservative Party, I mean, they would argue that they are still the dominant party on the right. They've got a hell of a lot more MPs than Reform. They've got a track record of governance, of delivering policy. I mean, surely that appeal to credibility, to competence is maybe the ace card that they've still got up their sleeve.
If I were in their shoes, I probably wouldn't appeal to competence. But they do have a lot of structural advantages, as you say, which means that they're not quite the default party of the right anymore, though. I think that's what's changed. They're actually going to have to compete for this. This election, they were able to basically say, if you vote Reform, you split our vote, and they were able to sort of cruise through in a few seats where they perhaps would not have done so. Next election, there's now common knowledge that people are supporting Reform to quite a large degree, and it will be a really competitive fight to see which the party of the right is. And Aaron, just come back to Labour for a minute. We saw some numbers yesterday. So of the top 100 seats for Reform, 64 are Labour held. The top 50, 33 are Labour held. Immigration is going to cut across those Labour areas like Brexit, right? It's going to make life complicated for Labour, particularly if Reforms start to appeal to Conservatives and none of the above voters and some disillusioned Labour voters. So where should Labour go on immigration between now and 29?
I suppose there's one school of thinking which says they can't really own that issue. They can mitigate it. They can kind of try and make it a secondary, or third or fourth order importance. But they need to really play to their strengths, which I think is probably true. What I would say, though, is that, broadly speaking, we can talk about Reform doing really well. They're finishing first, not just according to this poll, by the way, also YouGov. You can't just write this off. Also YouGov. And I think that is a massive indictment on the big two. I don't mean to take anything away from people who are doing their job well, but I think, frankly, that is an indictment, particularly, obviously, with Labour being in government, on them. They have failed on so many policy issues. I actually sometimes watch them, I think, are you trying to become as unpopular as quickly as possible? And I suppose the bad news for Reform is Labour could get better. Is it possible really to imagine a political operation getting any worse than this? I find that personally hard to believe, but maybe I'm wrong.
Charlie, there's a problem potentially for reform here, which Aaron, I think, is alluding to, which is expectation management. So number one in the national polls already, only a few months on from 24. How on earth does Nigel Farage and reform manage expectations?
Well, I think there needs to be lessons learned for reform when it comes to actually implementing the kind of change that they are, so confidently talking about. Because if you look at the first Trump term, for instance, he talked a good game, but he was actually not able to implement a lot of the things that he promised. And that was because he was up against a system, a kind of managerial state that at every turn was blocking him, and it was not obeying orders, and it was not doing as it was told. And I think that we're going to have a very similar problem in the UK because the civil service is so thoroughly captured by left-wing, progressive, pro-mass migration ideology that I think there needs to be a real kind of almost like Project 2025 type offering from reform to show that they are actually aware of the gravity of the situation and the scale of the problem that they're actually attempting to take on.
Well, maybe Project 2029 coming soon. Thank you, Sam, and to my panel. Now